something in my brain, probably, it might have been biological, but whatever it was, and Jesus hadn't come yet, and the kids were growing up, and eventually, it's growing up, I guess is what it is, and I thought, oh boy, I'm becoming more mature in my faith. And eventually, after 2 or 3 years of meeting these different types of Christians, my sermons started having less hell and more love. You know what I mean? I became more of a moderate. Instead of thinking about how to, the afterlife, how are you going to make it to the afterlife, I was preaching more about how do we live this life, right? Which is kind of standard fare in many mainstream or Protestant, whatever, denominations. And so there was a shift in my thinking, and I started embracing differences within Christianity. I realized there is no one Christianity. There are probably as many Christianities as there are Christians, if you think about it. Each one kind of has its own, their own kind of emotional or intellectual, whatever, and they pick the church that fits them. It's not the other. The churches don't create this mosaic. The mosaic's there, and people find the one. If you're an emotional type who likes speaking in tongues, you're going to go to a Pentecostal church. You're not going to be happy in one of these more cerebral, you know, liberal churches. So I started a process of moving across the spectrum where I thought, wait a minute, I've been preaching against all this stuff. What do I actually know? I've always said humanism is horrible. What is humanism, you know? And eventually I kept moving across, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. I started reading, actually reading theologians and reading outside of my prescribed list of Joshua McDowell and C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer and all those, you know, all those people. By the way, Frankie, his son, now has come out with an expose of that whole thing. What was the name of his book? Who was telling me? He has a new book out. But I was migrating and moving across this spectrum, realizing that what the differences between the different Christian groups primarily have to do with what they consider essential and what is not. If you take all the doctrines from the Bible, right, put them in a certain order, you have things like the existence of God, the divinity of Jesus, you know, all of that, the Trinity, maybe whatever, and these other things, the faith and regeneration and the death and the resurrection. But down here at the bottom you find things like, should women wear gold in church? Paul said no, women should not wear gold in church. A lot of things. Paul said it is not good for a man to touch a woman. You know, there's a lot of these other little teachings that you think don't merit the top of the list. Well, what distinguishes these Christian groups is where they draw their line on that list between what is essential and what is not. The real conservative fundamentalist types draw their line way down here, right, toward the bottom. And all these other doctrines are, you got to follow the church teaching. But the higher you go, the more liberal the church becomes. Until you get way up here, a lot of liberal churches don't care about any of this other. They don't care about the resurrection of Jesus. They think even that was probably just metaphorical. But they still have this some divinity of Jesus, divinity of God. Well, I started moving across that spectrum and realizing my line was going up, and it never stopped. The line just kept going up, 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 and just never stopped. I finally got to the end here. I thought if I peeled back the onion, I'd find this mere Christianity, which C.S. Lewis wrote about. Well, we would find this core. You know, this would be the actual, real, essential truth. But I kept peeling the onion back, and I just kept swinging across the spectrum, and I got to the end there in my own mind. And I realized, you know, if the prodigal son is a parable that Jesus made up, and if Adam and Eve are a metaphor, well then maybe God himself is just one huge figure of speech. Maybe that's all it is. If we're going to draw this line, who's to say where we draw the line? Oh, this part is metaphorical, so we don't take that literally. Well then, some people, there are actually some believers who say hell is a metaphor, but do they say the same thing about heaven? You know, they want the heaven, they don't like the hell. But, so eventually I finally came all the way to the end, and the phrase I use is I dumped out all the bath water, and I found out there's no baby there. And that was scary. And I was still outwardly preaching. And I was still this, and in my mind, through nobody's prompting, I didn't see some atheist evangelist on TV. No secular humanist came to my door and started arguing with me. It was none of that. It was just me in my own mind. And I think that's what makes it precious. I think most of you who were raised religious, you did it on your own, didn't you? It was your own thinking. Nobody was, you wouldn't want it to be somebody else's thinking. You know, some authority telling you. You want it to be your own thinking. And in my own mind, I realized you know what? There actually are no evidences for a God. There's actually no clear definition of a God. There's no coherent definition of a God, and many of the definitions are self-contradictory. There's no agreement among believers about the nature or the moral principles of this God. There are no good replies to the positive arguments against the existence of God. For example, the problem of evil. There finally is, and there are no good arguments for a God. You know, the so-called cosmological first cause and ontological. Bertrand Russell briefly was convinced there was a God when he was a young man by the ontological argument, and the next day he woke up and said he realized that all ontological arguments are just bad grammar. That's what they are. And he was embarrassed to admit that briefly he was convinced. And so there's no good arguments. And finally, there's no need for a God. Millions of good people live happy, moral, productive, meaningful lives without believing in a God or a superstition or a transcendent world. And many of you here were born without any belief, right? Some of you were born and raised without, like my wife, Annie Laurie, was third generation atheist. And of course, our daughter Sabrina now, who's in college, is a fourth generation atheist. And I remember telling her a few years ago, you know, Sabrina, just because you're our daughter doesn't mean you're like, just because you're an atheist family doesn't mean you have to be an atheist, you know. And Dawkins is on that thing, you know, just because children are in a Catholic family doesn't mean they're Catholic children. They're children of Catholic parents. And it's wrong to say, oh, that's a Muslim child, that's a Protestant child. It's a child. And I told Sabrina, you know, you're your own self. You don't have to think like me or like your mom. You're free to do it. If you want to become a born-again Christian as a result of your own thinking, you know, we'll love you still. We might argue, but we'll, you know, that's fine with you. I want you to know that. You're not an extension of us. You're your own person. And you know what she said? She looked at me and she said, oh, Dad. So, oh, thank you, Selma. What does the Bible say about if you give a glass of water to the least of one of these, you have done it unto me. So anyway, that's skirting and leaving out a lot of the details. And in my book, I explain a lot of the details, the theological and that, the contradictions in the Bible, the fallacies of these arguments for a God, and so on. And since then, I've done 71 formal public debates on each of these issues, and keep finding even more evidence to solidify non-belief. Do I have time to tell the last little story? What are we doing for time here? Oh, okay. It took me 4 or 5 months before I actually came out. I was still a preacher. The summer of '83, I realized I was a brand new baby atheist, and for all I knew, I was the only one in the world. I thought there must have been others, and I didn't know if I would like them even, you know? Because you know what you hear about atheists. And I didn't care. It was just me, my own thought. I had to realize in my own thought, yep, I guess I'm an atheist, that's what I am. But I had a calendar with dates on it, and I didn't make a lot of money preaching, but there was some money from love offerings and that. So I was a horrible hypocrite for those few months. I should have stopped right then, right? In honesty, I should have stopped. But how do you stop on a dime after all those years? And so it's kind of interesting, though, that I was a hypocrite. I learned something. I would be up in the pulpit like this and preaching this Word of God, not believing a thing of it, and hating myself and wondering, I got to get out of this. I got to stop this. And after one of the meetings, a woman came up to me. People would come and get saved, you know? And I thought, this is surreal. This is just crazy. A woman came up to me and she said, Reverend Barker, I want you to know I really felt the Spirit of God on your ministry tonight. And I'm thinking, you did? So what's going on there? What was she feeling, you know? It showed me that what's happening, religion is a big drama is what it is. Everybody's playing their part. The minister, no minister or priest or rabbi would have any position of authority or respect unless there were sheep out there giving that to them, right? If nobody came, then they wouldn't have that. It's based on this agreement that we're playing the same game. So, and of course some people would have said, and I would have said earlier, that if you preach the Word of God, it doesn't matter if you're an atheist, the Word of God is still powerful and can still save, right? Which sounds like a rationalization. But in any event, she told me she felt the Spirit of God on my ministry. That's what she felt and what she said. So I'm glad I finally stopped it. It was this December of '83 when I did my last sermon up in Auburn, California. They told me there was an atheist in the audience. They were all praying for this guy named Harry. And since I was going to do mostly music and just a little bit of preaching, Harry came to church. His young, new, born-again wife said, "Come to church, it's just going to be music."